Good day, ladies and gentlemen. It is October. It is a time to review horror films. Too bad it's already October 26th. This month went by way too bloody fast because there are all sorts of obscure horror films that I could cover. Now, today I am joined by Reignick,
Whoa.
and we are going to be discussing a classic horror film from 1974, Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter.
This movie was to be Hammer Horror's entry into a film franchise. It was supposed to be their adventure line. Unfortunately, that was not to be, for Hammer Horror after this movie ran into financial troubles and shut down shortly thereafter. It's a real shame because this movie is actually quite good.
And this is an example of a film that, sadly, would likely not be done today. What Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter is a detective slash horror film with a little bit of swashbuckling thrown in. Now, I discovered this film quite by accident. I was just reading some TV tropes articles on Hammer Horror, and I was like, Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter? What the hell is this? I looked through the little article, and I don't think I actually even spoiled myself on it. And I looked on YouTube because there's a surprising number of films on YouTube in their entirety. And I just so happened to find Captain Kronos on the Hammer Horror YouTube channel, no less. And if you want to see this film, if what we say sounds cool, I recommend checking it out there. But they also have an ad for the Blu-ray release. And I'm going to tell you, this movie's good enough that I'm going to probably pick me up a Blu-ray copy of it.
Agreed. I remember seeing this film right about circa 1998, and rewatching it, I'm probably going to add to my collection.
So what is Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter? How does it begin? Well, it begins in the Drachenwald, a undisclosed part of Germany. We're just going to call it the Empire for short. In the Empire, we see some very attractive ladies frolicking in the forest. That was a Hammer Horror trope. Where, you'd have a lot of attractive women, and sometimes they just might be topless, but sadly, they're fully clothed here. And as they frolic, a evil figure is viewing them. And of course, one gets attacked. But her blood is not sucked out. Rather, her youth is sucked out.
Yes, in the typical Hammer Horror trope, all women are drop dead gorgeous, and all monsters are absolutely evil. Now, this vampire is different in the fact that, as Lotz mentioned, it does not drain blood, at least not as much as you'd think. It instead drains life force. This is actually touched upon a little further on.
Now, one of the questions I wonder is, did Vulture from the Spider-Man comics kind of draw inspiration from this, or was it sort of one of those things where two people kind of came up with the same idea around the same time, but unconnected from one another?
Well, the old lore states that there, and by old lore I mean legends, oral tradition of Europe. There are actually many different species of evil out there, and many different species of demon or beast, which could drain one's life. So it could be inspired by, or it actually could be the old lore, because there's creatures such as succubi and incubi, which drain life on their own.
Because what's always funny when people bring up, incubi, I always think of the band Incubus, which, honestly, the only songs I've ever heard from them were from the Halo 2 soundtrack.
Yeah, they had some good selling albums, but they were really kind of a flash in the pan.
Yeah, they're kind of like bands like Korn and things of that nature. Like, they were popular in their day, and now it's like, who?
Yep. When the changing of the genre happens, it has its victims, and its victims in this case with Incubus are there's not even enough to make a where are they now. It just poof, gone.
And so we get introduced to Captain Kronos in a suitably epic manner. He's out riding around in the forest, and Captain Kronos, he's a cool-looking guy. The guy they got playing him looks the part. Go on.
Yeah, Horst Jansen is the man playing him, although his voice is actually handled by Julian Holloway. And there's a reason for this, because Horst, while he's still around to this day, his dialect would be a bit hard to understand from the screening.
It sounded a bit like Schwarzenegger in some instances. And he's still alive, as Reignick mentioned. He's in his 80s now. In fact, he did a German game show last year, so he's still out there kicking around.
Very much so.
And the guy that got voicing him doesn't sound that bad, but he's a little too high-pitched for my taste.
Yeah, they scaled him on a little bit of a young scale for that. Subjective, although I've heard men of that age bracket sound like Kronos. It doesn't entirely fit so much, but it's not something so glaring as to pull you completely out of it.
Yeah,
it's passable.
Exactly. And, when you think about it, like, the real General Patton didn't really sound that graphically either, so there's that.
I wanted to speak. I sound like absolute hot garbage on the mic, but I don't look like I sound, so there you go.
Or do you? Or might you even just be a voice in my head that somehow has a microphone? What a twist.
Maybe. Hey, no!
Anyway, Venom aside. Okay, so what ends up happening is, Kronos come across this woman in the stocks, and she, of course, was put there because she was dancing on a Sunday.
Yep, thou shalt not work on the Sabbath, and this includes dancing. Hard to tell exactly what part of the world they're in as in terms of Europe, but you can tell it's very much a devout one if they're going to put someone in the stockades in a pillory for dancing on a Sunday.
For whatever reason, that kind of reminds me of, like, Moby Dick. I think that happened in that. I think, like, Ahab's wife got put in there or something? I don't know why I'm thinking of that.
Oh, there was a pillory in Moby Dick, but I'm going to have to reread it if I'm going to reference that one.
Yeah, I haven't read that in probably over a decade. But anyway, giant dicks aside, what ends up happening is he lets her go because he's a badass. He is the superhero of this film. And he is, of course, armed with a katana.
Which is very strange and actually brings about an important point about Kronos. There's an air of mystery about him. We know he is a captain, as evidenced by his regalia, his garb, his saddle, and his blanket, as well as his signet ring. These are the trappings of someone who has seen quite a bit of actual military acclaim through battle. The katana, when you look at it, and yes, it actually is a katana, this isn't just weeaboo mind bullets here, actually brings up a bigger mystery about Kronos. Because given the era that this is in, you can tell that he is either fluent in Dutch, is Dutch, or has served the Dutch, or has encountered someone of that background. Because those are the only people that were allowed into Japan to trade. So either he went to Japan on a Dutch ship, serving under, his charge, and took that katana in a rather unscrupulous manner, which is not very likely because his character is shown all throughout this movie, or he earned it.
Honestly, I'd love for there to be like some sort of reboot with like a comic book reboot, I should say, or a comic book continuation, not even a reboot, because like you could get an adventure out of that. That katana could be an adventure all its own. It's like, since we know he's had dealings with the supernatural, you could have it be like he's like on a trade mission in Japan, right? And like some like Oni attack, or I don't even know what the mythology of Japan is, unfortunately. So, like, I imagine, like, I know Oni are, like, the demons, but, like, whatever Japanese equivalent to, like, a vampire would be, Like, he fights one, and, like, he's gifted this katana by the local, shogun.
Could be Jiangxi, could be Kappa, could be Oni. Could be a myriad of things. So their lore is quite extensive when it comes to monsters and vampires.
So what ends up happening is we also get introduced to Captain Kronos' butler, who I think would go on to inspire the friar character from Van Helsing. The butler is actually named after a famous painter, you say
Hieronymus. Hieronymus Roche. In this case, he's named after the painter Hieronymus Bosch, which, if you actually have the time, go out and take a look at his paintings, but be warned right now that some of them are unsettling.
which is rather fitting for a horror film such as this. So they end up going to town, and Kronos meets up with his doctor friend there, and surprise, vampire. And there's this conversation about how there are different types of vampires, how there's different ways of fighting them, and things of that nature.
Right. The Dr. Marcus is honestly rather surprised the concept of vampires in his Hamlet. But that being said, he is told that there are very different ways of fighting vampires. Each one has a very different way of attacking their victim. In this case, the vampire drains youth as opposed to draining blood.
We also end up seeing the vampire. Now, the vampire, you don't see him till, like, the ending. And, like, he's basically dressed like the Grim Reaper. He's got this big cowl on and everything. But there's actually kind of I don't guess it's hilarious, but out of context, it would seem kind of hilarious. Like, he's stalking some more young girls, and he walks by a flower bed, and, like, all the flowers die. It's like, well... It does bring kind of a logical question up. Like, if he can drain life force from flowers, why doesn't he just, like, drain a tree versus a person, you know?
In that case, I can only assume there's not as much life force there to drain, as it's not a sentient creature. But that's almost a theological argument right there.
Which would probably take too much time, but it's like, why does he just, like, drain a tree? Like, you know, it's the same issue with, like, vampires. Like, why do they drink human blood? The way I figure it with that is, my headcanon is the reason they got to do it is, like, they're kind of, like, sucking up, like, some kind of soul energy, like, out of a person, which you couldn't get out of, like, a cow or a tree, you know? It just doesn't have it.
In this case, it's actually codified in that manner, because the vampire, she, we don't entirely know, because, mysterious cowled figure, is literally taking life out of them, like in as mentioned, a succubus or incubus, though it's done with the result of blood on the lips.
And here's something that's kind of mean and funny at the same time. Since this is a movie from 1974, all the actors are, of course, aged by this point, so it's like all the attractive women get turned into old women. It's like, oh, they look like they do now. Zing.
Oh. Very much so. Time is not a patient master, nor is it a kind mistress. It does awful things to us, like, the onset of aging.
Yes. So we also get introduced to some aristocratic characters at a funeral. Well, not a funeral, at a graveyard, actually. You got this guy, whose name I don't remember, but I know you remember him.
Yes, Sir Hagen Dunward's son, Paul Dunward, is placing a wreath. He comes from his carriage, places a wreath on Hagen Dunward's grave. And on it, you can tell the wreath is not from him, but from Hagen's wife.
And, I'm not going to spoil anything, but around this part of the movie, after everything I was showing, I was like, I'm calling it. I'm calling it. I'm not going to call what, but I'm just calling it. And we'll see what happens afterwards. So, Captain Kronos, this movie had a lot of fan service, and it kind of takes a little while before the film starts up. You see a lot of Captain Kronos just kind of lounging around, smoking a big ass cigarette.
Yeah, he must have gotten the cigar from the same place that Clint Eastwood got his during the good and the bad and the ugly phases.
Actually, when I saw this film, I was like, him and Clint got to team up one day, but sadly, that's probably not going to happen.
Not in live action, but there's always comics.
That's true. And who knows, maybe this is like the 1800s. It's like, what's kind of funny is there's a bit of overlap when you think about it. All we see in this film is some basic medieval tech, but it could just be like this really out of the way, like Kriegsgrad town that just doesn't have a lot of modern technology. It could like take place in the 1860s,
Right. All we know is that, number one, this is right after the Middle Ages, because the plague is what took Hagen Dunward's life. Is Hagen Dunward, that grave, it was supposed to be that region's finest swordsmaster. He was supposed to be unmatched by anyone except by God. And
I just realized something while we were recording. It's like, if I want to be like a weeb, and I will, you could almost say that like Captain Kronos is in some respect kind of like a Ronin. He's got his katana, and he just is constantly looking for like adventures to undertake. Unless I'm getting the concept of the Ronin wrong.
Well, no, because a Ronin generally is a masterless samurai. He's looking for a means to sustain himself, and usually that involves, well, you got a strong sword arm, you might as well use it. If anything, this is very much like Hammer Horror's take on Robert E. Howard, yes, the same man who made Conan, his character Solomon Kane, although this is a little bit more upbeat and not as grim dark as Solomon Kane can be.
It's really a fairly kind of happy film in many instances, and it's got a lot of fan service. It is equal opportunity fan service as well. You do get some full frontal female nudity, because the woman that is saved, Carla is her name, becomes an assistant to Captain Kronos. She'll help him out now and again, and help him out in certain other ways. But it's not just limited to her. Captain Kronos, he's walking around pretty much stripped to the waist for a good chunk of the film.
This is done for two reasons. Number one, for obvious fan service, because let's be absolutely honest, horror movies are date movies. That's how it goes. That, and it actually builds upon one thing. You see a rather impressive scar running from the front of Captain Kronos' torso all the way around to his right edge, all the way down to his back. And that scar is basically there from a previous battle. Marcus actually confronts him when he's that way, judging his character, saying, "You got guts, Kronos. I've seen them."
Well, what's kind of funny about the scar, though, is if you were to watch this on like a VHS or a tube TV, it looked pretty good. However, in modern day HD, you can kind of tell it's just kind of it's stuck on Horst's body. It's pretty obvious, unfortunately.
Yeah, it's the best of 1970s effects, and 160,000 pounds for the entirety of the movie.
Which, a movie made on that kind of money, this thing looked really good. The set design is absolutely excellent, and the wardrobe is also pretty good as well.
Yeah, they actually did quite a pretty good job on most of the movie. For everything from the practical effects to the wardrobe, editing, cinematography. The only thing I can really knock them on is the music, and that's because it doesn't stick with you. It serves its purpose, but it's just sort of there. It never gets in the way.
I'd actually agree. When we finally get to the fight scenes, I'll bring it up more, but it does not. You got to remember, this is 1970s. You don't really have that the modern day orchestral, the bomb bomb. You don't have that. You've got random trumpets now and again that will play and be really out of place.
Right. Thankfully, they haven't fallen onto the orchestra sucks trope, which seems to be the AirSat's go-to for modern films and unfortunately a lot of modern video games. Seriously, guys, would it hurt you in any way, shape, or form to hire smaller bands and actually artists who don't try to rip off musical scores so often? Be a little bit original.
Exactly. There's more to life than Hans Zimmer. But Hans Zimmer aside, it's time for Captain Kronos to finally start trying to find the vampire. Because remember, this is a mystery. And so he starts setting some traps in the forest for the vampire. And this is where, if you're not really up on your vampire lore, it's going to seem kind of weird. Because, he's not hanging up garlic. He's not, sprinkling holy water around. Instead, he's burying frogs. And the idea is, if a vampire walks over a dead frog, the frog will come back to life.
Right. Basically, it's based off an old nursery rhyme with a grain of truth to it, as they say in the film. And it really is old vampiric, legend from Romania. It's, I say Romania. It could be from Romania. It could be from Carpathia. And this is centuries old lore. This could come from anywhere. And
so they start trying to track down the vampire. Now, we end up cutting to this random tavern, and there's these three ruffians in there, and they kind of just act like assholes, as you would expect. And they threaten one guy with a rapier. I don't think they kill him. I think they let him go, but they, like, humiliate him.
They
Okay.
let him go, but the thing is you can tell these guys are they're pretty good at what they do, at being thugs, but that's all they do is be thugs. And you can tell the bartender wants them gone because they show in the scene as he is threatening this individual who unfortunately is sitting down, so he can't draw his sword in any due time to attack back. He's reaching for that mallet just to cave one of their heads in. He wants to badly.
Yeah. The old smack to the head. This, of course, is it's pretty telegraphed that, Kronos, he's either gonna kick the crap out of him or he's gonna cut him up. And when Kronos shows up, this is actually a really good scene, and something that actually kind of stands out in the 1970s. Kronos and Hieronymus go in there. Now, Hieronymus, he's a hunchback, and he and Hieronymus go into the bar. He's going to get something to drink, and of course, the thugs, they go up, they start talking shit about Hieronymus, making fun of his hunchback and everything, and Kronos is like, you shouldn't make fun of people with physical disabilities. These days, that'd be virtue signaling. Back then, it actually meant something.
Right. Back then, it was actually code of chivalry. There are certain mannerisms, manners, expectations, and customs which meant to be followed in public. You can tell very clearly that Kronos, while he is definitely a fighter, he is a gentleman, first and foremost.
And then we get the first fight of the film. And since Rain actually knows way more about sword fighting than I do, he can actually give you a better play-by-play of what happens. But basically, I'll just set it up. Kronos cuts him up, and then they all kind of die in really, really overdramatic poses.
Right. Essentially, Kronos had set his katana on the bar, and this, I'm sorry, does sound rather weebish, but there's a reason he does it. He turns to his drink, red wine, grabs it, and he tells them off. He turns around, and the sword is facing against him, against his back, with the blade facing away from him. In this fight, and I can't really call it a fight because it's done in one smooth movement, one flash. Kronos reaches for the sword, and actually, this is very strange because this is one of the two times you can tell that the writer and director are of the same mindset, and they have a little bit of exposure to actual Japanese martial arts. He immediately grabs the blade, and before the thugs can reach for their rapiers, he immediately executes what's called iagiri. In one smooth movement, he takes the blade, yanks it out of its scabbard, the saya, and slashes across all three of them. And I would give them points for this, except there's one major mistake, and this mistake is a trope through this movie, and it sends people like me who have experience in historical European martial arts and iaijutsu into a fit of just almost rage. After a slash like that, your sword's going to be incredibly bloody. There's a technique for removing the blood called chiburi, which is followed up by returning it to the scabbard, the saya, which is called noto. Captain Kronos does neither. He jams the sword right back into the sheath, blood and all.
Well, he's Captain Kronos, not Samurai Jack. He doesn't know.
Well, this is a trope of sword abuse, and it continues through this film.
Oh, we'll get to that in just a moment. So basically, he kicks the crap, slices the crap out of the random thugs. And then he, of course, goes back to check his traps to see if any vampires had been away. And the vampire, of course, is out there. And Dr. Marcus, which is his friend in the film, ends up getting attacked by the vampire and turned. There's a little bit of a arty moment where everything freezes a little bit, but 70s.
Yeah, the scene basically was to reflect that the doctor was beset upon, and within that second, he has no recollection of what happened within that span of time. It's shorthand, but it's the best they could do on their admittedly thin budget.
And then we get to the scene that we alluded to earlier in the review. Okay, so now Marcus is a vampire. He knows he's a vampire. He hasn't like had his brain, fried to a mush like most vampires have. And so he's like, I need to be killed. And so Kronos straps into a chair and proceeds to try to do just that.
Knocks him out with that massive signet ring, screams for screams for strong rope, and this scene, oh boy. Let's go for it.
It's almost a comedy. It's like, okay, first they try to use a stake. That doesn't kill him. Then
not even a drop of blood, just an immediate scar.
Yep. Then they hang him. You literally see him hang him. And that didn't work. And then, just as they're about to set him on fire, he accidentally cuts himself with his own crucifix, and that kills him.
Yep. He falls on his own cross. And that's admittedly a pretty big cross, but it was the material that killed him.
Cold iron, as you would expect from Dungeons and Dragons fame.
Yep, they stuck to the old lore, and cold iron actually does it. Although there is a gaff here. They call it steel. It's actually not, and there's a reason why it's not. It's actually, the gaff is only in that one line. Otherwise, it is absolutely correct.
Which is kind of funny when you think about it. It's like, if they called it cold steel, that means something completely different.
It's either a knife company or a horrible Sonic OC.
Exactly. And I don't think people even who work for Cold Steel are even born yet. Oh, they might have been.
Lynn Thompson was, but he must have been. Film was made in 1974, April 7th. So he must have been about 8 or 9. He wasn't that old.
Even then, he was like really good at making knives.
Apparently.
But after that, they figure out that that's how they're going to be able to kill vampires. And so, Hieronymus makes Kronos a cold iron sword.
Yep, they go forth to the graveyard yet again, and they find a rather large crucifix grave marker, which has a cold wrought iron inlay of, just solid. The chunk of metal raw would have weighed right at around 10 pounds, not counting the cross itself, which is made of wood. But this actually leads to a fight scene. As the Doctor is killed, there's a mob that forms. I'll let you take this one.
All right. And, of course, Kronos has to kick the crap out of him. Now, one thing that you mentioned, Rain, that I wasn't aware of when I actually watched it, I must have missed it, or I just misremembered, but I thought he was actually trying to, stab him. But you did mention that he was just trying to knock him out, which he does. And admittedly, the fight scene isn't that bad, but it's a little chaotic, and it does look phony at times.
Right. Remember, the budget for this film is £160,000. Now, the mob in this scene, which is right around 8-10 individuals, you can tell very quickly that they were very quickly told to go through this scene, and they didn't have a lot of time for a lot of massive choreography. Now, Kronos himself, actually, this is the second part of the movie where the director and writer show that they actually have an understanding of Japanese martial arts, because immediately he decides he's not going to try to kill these men because he realizes they're misguided under the thrall of something. They're angry for a reason, but they don't quite deserve to eat the blade. So he sits down, and takes off his sword belt, sets his katana to the side, and he goes through this fight exclusively with his rapier. He's actually seated in a traditional Japanese pose. He's basically seated, legs together, sitting on his heels. This seems like some, an inconvenient way to sit, but it's actually done that way for a reason. It's because you can get up from that position very, very quickly just by lifting one of your legs and placing it down. Unlike sitting Indian position where you actually have to unfold your legs, and that actually takes some time.
So after he kicks the crap out of the townspeople. He ends up, I think, going back to the town, if I'm not mistaken.
Right. He goes back to the town, and from there, he
Go on.
gears up, knowing that he's got he goes on basically a vigilant moment of meditation while Hieronymus makes his sword. Now, back to the sword. And the original frog trap that they had set up to try to discern, okay, which way is the vampire moving? Unfortunately, back to the sword abuse. Kronos uses that katana like a shovel.
Yeah, not something I'd recommend in real life.
No, the earth is rather abrasive, and it will dull a blade rather quickly.
Especially a beautiful katana blade like that. The katanas are primarily slashing swords more than anything else, so...
Thrusts with a katana are rather difficult. They can be done, but it lends itself mostly to a slash as opposed to a hack or a thrust.
And one of the things we also end up learning about Kronos around this time is that he was bitten by a vampire. Now, Hieronymus says, like, you were a better man than he was. It's like, well, I'm not sure how accurate that was. It's like, how exactly do you measure better man? But whatever. It's kind of like a call forward to Blade in many instances.
Very much so. I mean, if anything, this it kind of calls to later series such as Blade, Vampire Hunter D, and all that, in the fact that Kronos was bitten by his family, his turned family. He had to take them down. And he's a bit of a Dhampir, as it is, opposed to proper vampire.
Oh, and one thing we did not mention is that vampires can walk around in the sunlight in this.
Yes, these are not your traditional full-on. They share the weaknesses of the Bram Stoker's cannot go out into the sun, cannot cross running water vampires, but they don't have that weakness. They have very specific weaknesses.
Which I've always found kind of funny when it comes to vampires. There's actually a YouTube video I saw many years ago talking about vampires. It was a short, like, 2-minute video, but it was like, hey, yeah, you got a point there. It's like, vampires, they got so many weaknesses, but zombies can only be killed by a shot to the head.
Yeah, it depends. I mean, Romania has their own take on it. Bram Stoker has his own take on it. The old legends, vampires were something to be feared because, it's not like, oh, well, vampire can only come into your house if invited. No, vampire can go wherever the hell it wants to go.
There's actually a book I read that had a vampire like that, where, like, you can only come in if it was invited. So you know what it did? All it had to do was take over your mind and have you say, you can come in! And then he comes in and eats you. That was actually from Monster Hunter International. For those who have never heard of that particular book series, it's absolutely excellent.
Definitely worth the read.
So if you like Monster Hunters, it's set in the modern day, and it's monster porn / gun porn. There's a lot of gun descriptions in that, and they got vampires, they got zombies, they got werewolves, they got orcs that fly helicopters, and it's amazing.
And you can actually buy the Cazador rifle that was featured in the books.
Which is pretty hilarious when you think about it. It's like, it's being defictionalized. Now, when can we go hunting werewolves? Unless they're good this time. And don't
know about werewolves, but there are some feral orcs around here that definitely need a killing.
Now, if only they could be taught how to fly helicopters, then that might turn out better. But anyway, job placement programs and helicopter pilots aside, the film finally comes to a head at Lord Durmont's house, the guy from the first part of the film. Now, we've seen him throughout the film, and there's some foreshadowing that this is where the vampire is going to live. Now, the female character, Carla, is not forgotten at this point. One of the things that's always kind of annoyed me about certain... Now, this is not really a superhero film, but in the same vein, a lot of side characters just get forgotten, or they're utterly useless. Like, the first time the bad guy shows up, they just they push over. In this, Carla is not. In fact, she ends up volunteering to, like, act as bait. Because Kronos knows that the vampire's at this house. but he doesn't know where this vampire is. So it's like she'll go in there, lure him out, then he'll come in and chop the head off.
Right. She's actually got a spine in this one. She knows that what she's walking into is pretty much certain death if anything screws up.
But it's Kronos, and he don't screw up. One thing that's kind of funny, though, the vampire finally reveals themselves, and it's Lady Dermont, the person from the beginning of the film. I was like, I called it. I called it at that point. Like, it's going to be her.
Yeah, Lady Durward, you see her aged face in the shadows for quite a bit of the movie, but she right as the doctor was turned, it was revealed that, the victim before she died saw someone old, someone very, very old. Problem is, that's a bit of a red herring. It was done that way because a youth-stealing vampire shouldn't appear old unless it's starving.
And she certainly wasn't, considering how many young ladies she was snacking on this entire film.
Yeah, and let's be honest, Lady Durward was rather young-looking.
Yeah. Another attractive woman, although she was a bit older than the traditional woman in this particular film. Probably in her late 30s, I'd say.
Yeah, mid to late 30s. Very good complexion, though.
I'd say. So what we got is Lady Durwood is, of course, using the vampire mind stare, controlling Carla and about to eat her. This is where, now, when Rain and I were discussing this earlier, you mentioned that, he was trying to be sneaky. It just, to me, when I first saw the movie, it was like, come on, hurry up already! It's like, you're cutting it kind of close there, Captain.
He's trying to make as little noise as possible, being a proper vampire hunter, realizing, hey, this isn't some trope. You can't just go in there, all a future Rambo and start killing everything. You have to have a bit of guile to it. But then he hears the scream of Carla and is like, screw it, through the window.
Yep. Ha-ha! And then we learned that Lady Durwood, was it Durwood or Dermont?
Dermont.
Okay, Durmont was trying to and succeeded in raising her dead husband that we were also introduced to at the early part of the film. And of course he shows up, and then we got sword fight time.
Yes, Hagen was bested by no one except God, said Captain Kronos. Well, he gets to test his newfound cold iron blade against him. And we find out very quickly that Hagen actually is quite a good swordsman and quite a bit of a dirty fighter.
Also, one of the things that Kronos was able to do is he was able to neutralize the wife pretty easily because he uses the sword to reflect the mind stare back at her, so she's basically frozen for the entire fight. Because taking on two people at once, especially two vampires, not a good prospect.
Very much so. Thankfully, she is neutralized by her own attack. Very Medusa-esque. Not quite turned to stone, but definitely frozen in place. And the fight begins in proper. Lady Durward can't do anything, but Hagen sure as heck can, and he opens up strong. He starts out immediately taking off his garb and using that as a distraction. When that fails, you find him kicking quite a bit, which is very unusual for someone wielding a rapier. Mainly because of balance. It takes a lot of balance to get kicks on target and then immediately riposte or slash. You can tell he is rather skilled, but the reason for his victories probably had to do with him being a dirty fighter.
And since this is an actual real fight going on, you can cut. The thing about now CGI fights, don't get me wrong, I think they look cool. They're great popcorn entertainment. But one of the best aspects of this fight is it's definitely a classic swashbuckling fight, and it's very well edited, no speed up, and you gotta remember, made on a super small budget, shoestring budget, basically a small sack of gold pieces. Okay. Compare this, if you compare this to a James Bond film of the era, this is like head and shoulders above that.
Right, this is very Errol Flynn. This is very, romantic era of swashbuckling movies. It's very well done, and for the fact that they are on such a shoestring budget, the choreography is well paced, and there's not a lot of jump cuts. I counted maybe one or two, and they're mostly just scene transitions as opposed to, oh crap, we wrote ourselves into a wall in this fight, and now we need to switch positions for the reason of we need to make this scene believable.
And it feels like a real fight. You know, one of the things I really liked about the lightsaber duel in Episode 4, and Episode 4, you know, really draws a lot from the swashbuckling tradition, is that felt like a real fight. They're not jumping around, flying around, and if you actually look at a breakdown of that lightsaber duel from Episode 1, yeah, it looks good, but if you apply any tiny bit of logic to it, it's nothing but a show fight.
It's Raver Wars. Entirely too many times of the attacker or the defender taking their eyes off of their opponents, and really it's not a fight, it's a clinic. It looks good on cinema as an actual sword fight, one well placed riposte in the right place, and off goes an arm.
And that's the thing. This film gets it right. It's definitely a very brutal fight as well. You know, because Captain Kronos, he's getting his ass kicked now and again, but as you would expect, he eventually does triumph over the vampires. And it ends in many instances a lot like a western of the time, one of those spaghetti westerns of the time, because at the end of the film, all the vampires are dead, and Captain Kronos literally rides out of town. Carla, of course, stays behind, as is often the trope, and he rides off into the, I wouldn't say sunset because it's Britain, but overcast gray day. The end.
Yep. You can tell very clearly that Hammer was proud of this. They actually wrote a fairly good script here, and it was directed, written, and edited really quite well. They wanted to make this their hallmark. They wanted to say, okay, this is what we're known for. This came out before Star Wars did, so it's one of those that everybody was looking to. Let me rephrase this. The directors of the time had exposure to the serials of Flash Gordon and all of that, and they wanted to create something of that of their own. They wanted to create something for their future. And this pays homage to that. This was intended to be Hammer Horror's flagship serial. This was their hook to hang their hat upon. This was theirs.
And you know, it worked. That's the saddest part of it all. Is this film worked? When you see the poster, when you see the name Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, you're not really expecting much. But as you watch it, it's like, hey, this is a real movie. How did that happen?
Yeah, it's actually quite good. It's the closest thing we've seen to the serials of, you know, the 1910s, 1920s, and up till about the 1940s. Before this, that was it. And after this, we had the closest thing to it would be like the Indiana Jones movies and Star Wars, which, you know, back then in the 80s, were in the 70s, 80s, really quite good. And this movie was novelized in 2011, published by Random House by Guy Adams, but this entire universe, these characters would be very well suited to have their own comic, to have their own serialization in that form, because we can't really do anything live action wise.
I guess you could, but it probably wouldn't be. It wouldn't be as good as what we have here, you know.
Right.
It's actually getting like say a Netflix TV series of some description, that probably would end up being kind of ruining it. Just look at what they're doing to The Witcher, you know.
Oh, never mind. Looking at it right here. Titan Comics in 2017 did a 4-episode Captain Kronos comic. Although, I'm going to have to check that out, but honestly, there's a lot here that has so much promise. It needs to be worked on for more than just 4 issues. You could make a graphic novel this easy.
I mean, just the whole Japanese adventure alone would make for an interesting story to tell. You know, and I think when I say a lot of these movies just aren't going to be done again, you look at modern day films. Honestly, not all modern day films are bad. Don't get me wrong. Venom, which I recently did a video on and recently watched, was really good because it wasn't as overblown as a lot of modern day films are. But you ever go to like the cinema and you see all these trailers, you know? They're all overblown. They all take themselves so seriously. And I swear, a lot of these films are made just so you can have that trailer, you know?
It's the blockbuster reveal. Everybody's got to have it, and it's always got to have, your way past over the top symphonic screech right when something action oriented happens.
That's the thing. This movie, it's not, I wouldn't say it's like understated, but it has, it's a much more steady tone, and it's a serious film, but it doesn't always take itself 100% seriously either.
Right. If anything, I see it as a cure for the grimdark and the overly dramatic, overly serious, this is the end of the world thing that we see in cinema blockbusters today. This is the cure for the formulaic.
Oh, and talking about the end of the world. See, tomorrow, as of this recording, I'm going to go see Halloween 2018. Review forthcoming. There's a trailer that's been shown in the last 3 movies I've gone to see, and it was terrible the first time. I don't remember what it's called. I don't want to remember what it's called, but I'll know what it's called tomorrow. It's this live-action anime thing that's trying to be cyberpunk, but is so overblown, it just looks terrible. It looks cringy. I don't like to use the word cringy just because that word kind of annoys me at times. But it looks cringy. It's got like it's live action, but it's like this robot girl, and she's got you're the only one. You're so special. It's like, oh, come on. Come on, at least try a little harder. And like the art design looks like crap.
We just get William Gibson's Neuromancer made into film already. I mean, I've seen so many people try it, cyberpunk, but only 2 movies in live action here in the U.S. Big movies have gotten it right.
Let's see. Let me see if I can guess. Matrix and Johnny Mnemonic.
Nope. Although Johnny Mnemonic's not bad, it's definitely a great popcorn movie. It's Blade Runner and, oddly enough, the latest Ghost in the Shell, which I thought I would hate, but pretty good.
I need to still see Ghost in the Shell. What's kind of funny about Blade Runner, and we'll end the podcast soon enough. It's a film podcast. Just deal with it. It's funny about Blade Runner. When I first saw it back in 2008 or 9, I thought it was really boring. Come to find out, I was watching the wrong cut. That's one of those films, if you watch the wrong cut, you can definitely dislike it.
Yeah, it either plods or it's too quick, or you find the right director's cut and it's like, okay, now it's paced right.
Yeah, I got the one that really kind of drug a lot. But I don't remember which cut that I finally saw that was actually good. But it's like, oh, editing has a lot to do with a movie actually being good.
Right,
Kronos
pacing matters.
Exactly, and Kronos is well paced. It kind of drags a little here and there, but it doesn't drag enough that you're going to lose interest.
Right. Ian Wilson handled the cinematography fairly well, and James Needs, especially when it comes to action scenes, his editing was actually really, really quite good.
It's actually kind of funny when you think about that. Like, the editing in a 1970s film is actually better than the not Dark Knight, but Batman Begins editing. My God, was that hard to follow.
Ugh. I don't care if they added 90 more minutes to that and, actually explained everything in ludicrous, painstaking detail. That was a headache to watch.
Of course, to get off topic onto Batman for a moment, Batman, the live-action Batman, has not really had that good of fight choreography, and I think it stems from the fact that the Batman costume is so hard to move around in. I mean, Batman '89 did its best to get good fight choreography, but you can't move your neck. That kind of makes fighting a little difficult.
Yeah, that pretty much results that every quote-unquote fight is very short, sharp acts of violence, which, are just very punchy, and that's it. That's all you can do.
But Batman '89, that's a movie I need to review at some point, because that's a film that, I think a lot of people... We'll definitely wrap it up in a minute, but I want to talk about this because it popped in my head. Batman '89 and Batman Returns are two films that for some reason today people started hating on. I'm not really sure why.
Hipsters.
Yeah, I'm not surprised that they would, but it's like, because those films are still hold up. I mean, yeah, I get it. Batman does kill a few people, but, I mean, if they needed killing, just saying, it's the Joker, And he didn't technically kill the Joker in that movie, by the way.
No, the Joker killed the Joker.
Yeah. So, and he did not kill the villain at the end of Batman Returns either, just saying.
Yeah.
I think
Oswald Cobblepot did himself in on that one.
So there. And I think, like, the pacing in those movies was also quite good, and the overall storytelling was very much, like a classic film would have been. They weren't overblown and overwrought, and they were nice and weird, and that was something that really makes them stand out.
Yeah, and he had no choice to make them stand out. The simple fact that there was a lot of competition in 89 and 90. You either stand out from the crowd or you get lost in the shuffle.
Yeah, which sadly is the case with many of the modern-day superhero films. Modern-day superhero films work to a degree, but they do not stand up to repeated viewings.
It's formulaic. They find something that works, and they keep digging and digging and digging until they either hit, absolute bedrock, or they find an endless pit and they can't get themselves out.
Or they get woke, or go broke.
Oh. That's usually akin to having the whole collapse on you.
Yes. All right. Well, I am GeneralLotz, and I'm going to wish you good. The Horror of Frankenstein. And Reignick?
Any movie that doesn't sparkle. Vampires don't sparkle.
Damn straight. Well, whatever makes you happy. If you enjoyed the review of Captain Kronos Vampire Hunter, please consider subscribing, and if you can, please consider supporting me on Patreon so that I can continue bringing you these film reviews.